All right, everyone, welcome to our webinar. We'll give Zoom about 30 seconds to help everyone pile in. Great. Thank you, everybody. It looks like just about everyone is in. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Let's get started. So the topic is a report. So a summary of our report we just came out with yesterday called Money Left on the Table, Restoring Cap and Trade Auction Revenues Through Legislative Reauthorization. We have two guest speakers with us today that will respond to the report, kind of add their own color and take. So Lenny Hochschild, the founding partner of, or a founding partner of Environmental Commodity Partners LP, and Joe Gardias, Ralph Kavanagh Climate Solutions Fellow from the Natural Resources Defense Council. So thanks for joining us today, Lenny and Joe. So the overview of this report is that here's the executive summary. California gave away up to nearly $3 billion in revenues from its cap and trade program. Over the last year or so, this revenue would have otherwise been directly invested into communities and used to lower utility bills for ratepayers. Weak revenue results stem from tumbling allowance prices that have fallen from an all-time high of nearly 42 to near historic lows of 26, caused by uncertainty over legislative extension and delays in regulatory rulemaking. Our key finding is that restoring cap and trade auction revenue requires two actions in order: the legislator acting as soon as possible to extend the cap and trade program beyond 2030, and the California Air Resources Board resuming its rulemaking immediately thereafter and delivering anticipated allowance supply cuts. A note of caution is that we expect California will continue losing between around $600 million and $1 billion in revenue from each quarterly auction until the California legislature reauthorizes the program. That includes the upcoming auction, which will be held on August 20th, and future auctions as well. So that's the executive summary. I'll go through kind of two of our main figures, or our two figures in the report, kind of explain how we ran our calculations on lost revenue. So this is our main table in the report. And this table estimates lost auction revenue from the last 5 quarterly cap and trade auctions. There's a range of values between 1.80 and 2.94 billion in lost revenue over those last 5 auctions. The lower range represents lost revenue if we only count funds collected for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which invest in projects that reduce emissions in California communities. The upper range, that 2.94 billion, is the range from also including lost revenue from the value of consigned allowances to utilities, most of which are returned to ratepayers on their gas and electric bills through the California Climate Credit. So we present this range as one further level of detail. Table 1 shows the estimates of lost revenue have increased over time as auction prices have fallen, starting with a revenue loss of around 230 million USD in May 2024, up to nearly $1 billion, 961 million USD for the May 2025 auction. And those numbers are including both consigned allowances and GGRF revenues. A note on methods. To calculate lost revenue, we subtract actual revenues from the expected revenue that would have been achieved without uncertainty over legislative extension or regulatory delays. In the absence of uncertainty, we assume that allowance prices over the last year would have remained at $41.76 for current vintages and $41 for future vintages. These are the settlement prices from the February 2024 auction. And at that auction, market participants had few concerns over legislative extension and had strong conviction that CARB would expeditiously implement the supply cuts necessary to align the cap and trade program with California's 2030 target. Now, we'll elaborate on the next figure on that February 2024 timeline and why that's a reasonable expected allowance price. But to suffice to say for now that although this value is close to the all-time high value of allowance prices, we argue it serves as a reasonable counterfactual because it represents a likely allowance price if supply cuts had proceeded as initially anticipated. Our main argument is this is a market. It cares mostly about supply and demand, especially supply of allowances. And I think our next figure will elaborate on this. Okay, so speaking of that next figure, let's go to the next slide. So this figure traces allowance prices. It's a very busy figure, but I think it's very rich in terms of information. This figure traces allowance prices over the last 2 years as measured by front year futures. So these are the kind of most liquid product that are traded. And as you can see, allowance prices, this kind of trajectory is more or less a hump. And allowance prices during the first half of the hump rose to an all-time high of 41.91 as market participants really priced in an expectation that CARB would substantially cut the supply of allowances to align with California's 2030 climate targets. This follows from clear direction from Governor Newsom and the California legislature to increase the state's climate ambition by 2030 and through 2045. However, since March 2024, when you see the bump starting to crest and falling, allowance prices have undergone a bumpy descent back to their minimum values and have now settled in around $26. So this figure annotates significant events as bullish with the green captions or bearish with the red captions for allowance prices. The y-axis shows USD, and the blue line is the allowance price as it changes over time. That dotted blue line is the minimum price floor at quarterly auctions. So just to spend a minute or two on the increase in allowance prices and then the decrease in allowance prices. On the increase side, really a steady drumbeat of regulatory documents and informal workshops held by CARB motivated a $15 rally between November 2022 and February 2024. This flurry of activity was aimed at cutting allowance supply in response to several motivating factors, including the 2022 scoping plan, the updated AV32 greenhouse gas emissions inventory, executive orders, and aforementioned legislation for the 2030 and 2045 statutory targets. To kick this off, the scoping plan really set out the motivation for increased ambition. CARB then followed up with summer workshops that proposed substantial supply cuts. And then fall workshops in 2023 added finer details to potential supply cuts. Now to transition to when the price began cresting and lowering, allowance prices began a bumpy descent starting in March 2024. That is still ongoing. Allowance prices dropped around $15 over this period from March 2024 through today, settling in at around 26, as I previously mentioned. What really drove this delay is a series of rulemaking delays and growing uncertainty around legislative extension. And I'll just highlight a few kind of key moments. First, April and May 2024 workshops. CARB suggested in these workshops that tens of millions of allowances may be released into the market as program changes went into effect. This would cause downward pressure on prices. And then the May workshops also described pretty detailed proposals around allowance allocations, emissions coverage, and reporting. Taken together, that kind of series of workshops contributed to bearish market sentiment because they did not reassure an impatient market that supply cuts were necessarily forthcoming. So around these workshops, we see a decrease in price around $4 or $5. The July workshop was quite a marked price drop. At this workshop, CARB said that the rulemaking and supply cuts would not take effect in time for an allowance supply cut to be implemented in 2025. This represented a major delay in the rulemaking. In September 2024, CARB commented that the rulemaking would begin in the coming weeks. But then that release never came, which drove allowance prices down about $1.50. Similarly, on October 2024, there was a market notice that said the rulemaking would begin in the coming weeks. Again, the rulemaking did not begin, so that contributed to another downward price. And then to round us out, in January 2025, CARB commented on a number of political challenges that the state was facing and mentioned that the rulemaking was not imminent. And importantly, that CARB emphasized the need for the regulator and for the administration to support the legislator as it contemplates legislative extension. So we start seeing that uncertainty around legislative extension seep in. And finally, in March 2025, CARB updated its website to express a general commitment to pursuing the rulemaking in 2025, while saying that the administration is working with the legislature as they consider extension of the cap and trade program. So that's the blow by blow. When you kind of step back, the picture that becomes clear is that a real combination of rulemaking delays pinned to delayed supply cuts, and then increasingly uncertainty over legislative extension cause the fall in what were kind of all-time high prices and what were reasonable prices of around $41 to expect if CARB had followed through with its significant supply cuts. I will say one last comment here, which is surprisingly factors that I think maybe non-market participants would figure may have a very large role have in determining allowance prices have either a small or a non-role. So for example, one small but significant mover was the July 2024 announcement from President Pro Tem Mike McGuire that the Senate would be pursuing extension in 2025. That raised prices about $1.50. The executive order from Trump that explicitly called out the cap and trade program drove prices down about $2, but then they quickly recovered when I think most market participants realized the legal threats were smaller than they initially anticipated. A February comment from Governor Newsom, where he said extension this year in 2025 is not absolutely necessary. That didn't have much of an impact on allowance prices. And the April 2025 announcement from Newsom, Senate Pro Tem McGuire, and Speaker Rivas saying that the California leadership would double down on the cap and trade program this year rose prices about $1. So political announcements and potential legal threats have a small role, and in some cases no role, in explaining allowance price movements. So I will just step back and say one thing about the politics around market-based policies and affordability. Kind of pervading the whole 2-year chart that we've put together is the affordability crisis. And what we've experienced in California is that the market-based mechanisms for climate policy, whether it's the low carbon fuel standard or the cap and trade program, have been connected to the affordability crisis, in large part to a dedicated media campaign from oil lobbyists and oil associations. So this is example of two of the flyers on this facts per gallon campaign that has been going on in California for I think a couple years now. And I just wanted to acknowledge that affordability crisis is a serious issue and is one that has been connected to market-based policies. I wanted to just, as a cap and trade proponent, take a moment and say, in my view, cap and trade is the most affordable policy and is a part of the affordability solution, not necessarily a part of the affordability problem. I'll just say a few points. First, on a cost per ton basis, the cap and trade program reduces emissions much more cost effectively than any other approach in California. Second, the cap and trade program is unique in that it raises revenues that can be spent to help consumers who are facing higher prices and help consumers further reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And third, I'll say the cap and trade program has a number of unique features, whether it's output-based allocation or the California climate credit, that can be designed to mitigate price impacts in sensitive sectors. So I will say in closing that I think cap and trade has really unduly been wrapped up into the affordability crisis and mistaken for a potential cause of the affordability crisis, where I think as designed, and especially if designed and tweaked further, it is really a part of the affordability solution. With that, I'll conclude my remarks and I will stop sharing my screen and I will first pass to Lenny to respond.
Thank you, Clay, and good to be with you and Alicia and Joe today. And very simply, I thought the report was really well done, and to me, it highlighted for probably a variety of stakeholders what market participants have already known, and that is that current pricing in California, carbon allowances, is the result of the last year of rulemaking delays followed by legislative uncertainty. Clearly, to the points that you made, there's a lot on the plate of California state leadership managing a variety of very complex issues. And my sort of comments are just focused on encouraging California leadership not to let extension of this program slip beyond this year, given what will happen if the extension does not happen this year. Before getting into that, for those who may sort of disagree with what you laid out, Clay, and think that maybe prices of California carbon allowances are lower because of the April executive order from the Trump administration, we would argue that's very clearly not the case. All you need to do is look at the two other carbon markets in the United States, the one in Washington State, the other one in the northeastern US known as RGGI, where both of those markets are seeing prices trading well above their minimum prices and well within their expected trading ranges based upon their regional supply and demand. So the current pricing of US carbon markets across these three different programs is telling us that California policymakers' repeated delays are more of a concern to prices than the Trump administration executive orders. The main point, I would say is our expectation is that the extension will get done this year, which means in the next 8 weeks, as I understand the legislative schedule. However, if that doesn't happen, we think institutional investors who have mostly been patient over the past year will exit the CCA market due to what will be the continued lack of policy certainty. And what will be the results of that? The first thing is it'll result, in our strong view, on multiple failed auctions until there is policy certainty, and massive auction failures. We're not talking about the most recent failed auction where 5 or 6 million tons were not sold. We're talking about much more than that, maybe going back towards the early days of COVID levels. And so why will that happen? It'll happen because the market currently is oversupplied, as we all know, and we will have a dynamic of the compliance entities being able to purchase the allowances at below auction reserve prices from the existing investors. And so therefore our expectation would be that there would be zero revenues for the GGRF, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, going forward until there was some legislative certainty and some other policy certainty. Beyond that, another unfortunate side effect that will happen is the behavior of these institutional investors. So who are they, right? They're folks that are not traders sitting on the skyscraper in New York City somewhere. They're large institutional investors that take a long time to get comfortable with the market, and they get in, but once they get out, they leave, and once they leave, they're gone for a very long time. So think of private pension funds, think of public pension funds, think of large university endowments, climate foundations, energy transition investors, and other massive household name type financial investors that everyone would be familiar with. So from their perspective, if the state walks away from decades of promises and commitments in this market, right, the California cap and trade or California cap and invest market, it does not take much of a leap of imagination to then have these same institutional investors that finance either via equity or via debt many of the projects in other markets. So think of state renewable portfolio standards, or think of low carbon fuel standards, or even think of California policies beyond energy, where investors are relying on the stability of policymakers. So that's the second thing that will happen. We would think some of that capital will dry up. And then it would be difficult to see where replacement capital sort of comes to help California policymakers achieve the various initiatives. So in short, there's a lot riding on the next 8 weeks. Again, we know that California policymakers have a lot on their plate, but please do not make the mistake of thinking delaying this into next year is going to be okay, because it will not.
Thank you, Lenny. Appreciate the comments. I want to encourage everyone to submit written questions if you have them through the Q&A function. And now we will switch over to Joe.
Thanks, Clayton. So, as Clayton mentioned earlier this year, the legislature and governor expressed a desire to extend the cap and trade program in this legislative session. I wanted to really underscore that extending the cap and trade program provides California with a positive opportunity in a package to meaningfully address affordability, equity, pollution, and continued progress on climate change. By one, equitably immediately reducing electricity prices, two, directly reducing sources of criteria air pollution and toxic exposure in disadvantaged communities, and three, right-sizing the strength of the cap and trade program through improvements. So to touch on the affordability issue that Clayton mentioned, the cap and trade program currently provides a biannual lump sum climate credit that is put onto customers' natural gas and electricity utility bills. If the legislature were to reform the way that these proceeds are distributed, they could significantly reduce sticker shock electricity bills that customers are particularly experiencing in summer months, but also some customers are experiencing in winter peaking months. Electricity affordability is a big problem in California. NRDC's Powering Change report found that PG&E's electricity prices increased about 40% above inflation between 2018 and 2024, primarily due to wildfire spending. Combined with recent rate reforms that are set to go into place next year, targeting the existing residential electricity and gas, climate credits could reduce electricity prices by 20%. Immediately starting next year. This distribution method would keep building electrification and electric vehicles and trucks cost competitive, while also equitably providing the most relief for families living in hot climates that tend to be lower income and have larger bills in summer months due to air conditioning needs. A portion of the natural gas climate credit could also be diverted for the next decade towards transitioning low-income individuals and buildings off of natural gas appliance, as has been previously done with the electrical climate credit. While the portion of income that customers spend after accounting for necessary spending like housing is systematically larger for electricity bills than natural gas bills, which means that we want to direct most of the gas climate credit towards electricity prices. Also, a portion of that would be good to set aside to make sure that we're equitably transitioning lower income folks off of the gas system early to preempt future challenges with the natural gas transition. Another pretty significant positive opportunity that extending the cap and trade program opens is to maintain California's progress on increasing consumer access to zero emission vehicles and trucks, or cars and trucks. California's past leadership on investments in ZEVs has successfully resulted in about a 25.3% of new sales being zero emissions and about for passenger vehicles and about 5,800 new zero-emission trucks on the road in 2024. That's pretty significant. However, with the federal government attacking the state's standards on zero-emission cars and trucks, this trend is not guaranteed in the state, particularly in light of the federal HR1 or the Big Beautiful Bill, phasing out tax credits for new and used zero-emission cars, trucks, and charging infrastructure. The Governor Newsom's executive order earlier this year begins to fight back by reaffirming the state's commitment to the timely deployment of zero-emission trucks and cars, and asks agencies to identify additional actions for progress. So far, we've seen some early successes from this leadership. We've had a recent court ruling from a federal district judge that found that the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Charging money appropriated by Congress of about $5 billion must be provided to states, but there's still much more to do. And while California continues exploring alternative mechanisms to transition polluting vehicles, an important state action for this year is to secure previously committed levels of zero-emission truck and car fundings from last year's budget. While revenues are not the primary function of the cap and trade program, the state's current budget significantly reduces out-year commitments to zero-emission vehicles in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. To not invest continued funding levels for zero-emission vehicles in the next few years risks a dip in the current level of EV sales, which are close to an early majority technology adoption percentage, nearing the early majority portion of the commercialization curve. That's why it's critical that California continue providing deeper investments into zero-emission vehicles to meet the state's net zero emissions goal and reduce air pollution, all the while preventing future increasing rates of gas-powered vehicle sales that would create an upward pressure on gas supply. Extending the cap and trade program would further enable reconsideration of appropriations in the GGRF. California should seize the moment to backfill for lost progress at the federal level. Part of the solution includes strategically extending the cap and trade program, which is an important tool for reducing emissions from large polluters in the state to meet the state's carbon neutrality goal of 2045. So we think that all in all, this year presents the opportunity for the governor and legislature to work to thoughtfully extend the program so that we can reduce electricity prices, pollution, and right-size the program.
Thank you very much, Joe. Very eloquent description of NRDC's stance. Much appreciated. And last but not least, John, it seems like you've been able to join us. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. I'm sitting right outside of hearing room, but I'm able to chat for a few minutes here. I think, so first off, John Kendrick from the California Chamber of Commerce. I'd say for more than a decade now, cap and trade's been helping California deliver deep, cost-effective emissions reductions alongside some pretty phenomenal economic growth. It doesn't mean that cap and trade is without cost, as Clayton acknowledged, but smart market design has helped California decarbonize without draconian mandates. We've seen the quarterly allowance auctions have pumped nearly $30 billion into the GGRF, back in everything from wildfire hardening to transit modernization. And also, as NRDC was talking about, returning billions to households through the California Climate Credit on their utility bills. So by coupling a transparent carbon price with cost containment safeguards, leakage protections for trade-exposed industries, cap and trade has become California's, I think, most reliable engine for climate progress and clean economy investment. It's an achievement that we can't really afford to jeopardize. And as you guys have been talking about today, though, that success is at risk with the sunset in 2030. The long-term investments that need to be made to drive further emissions reductions, they depend on market certainty, stable financing horizons. Every month without a firm post-2030 framework injects additional risks into financing models. It raises borrowing costs, and it prompts companies to, frankly, redirect clean energy capital outside of the state. There's also a paralysis that comes in terms of decision making, right? Whether or not this program will continue to exist may impact companies' decisions to either invest in or stay in California. If you're looking at the prospect of something much more draconian coming your way, uh, much more strict than cap and trade, that could affect your investment decisions. So strong support for getting this reauthorized. We want to avoid some of the mistakes of 2016, 2017, when we saw I guess we've already seen it, right? That's what Clayton was talking about. We've seen billions of dollars wiped away from the auction floor. And, you know, we don't want to see stalling of clean energy projects. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. Great way to round out the responses. We have two open questions that we'll get to next. I will reiterate that if you have a question, please use the Q&A function. And Alicia, please monitor the Q&A and see if anyone else wants to ask questions bilaterally.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So for the first question, we have two questions. I'll read them and I'll take a shot at the first one. First is, did low auction prices result in a decrease of gasoline prices? And second is, what do we think might happen during the upcoming legislative process? Is it possible to amend legislation during this time period? So I'll take a whack at the first one. If anyone wants to add on, please chime in, and then I'll look to the crowd to respond to that second one. So on the first point, did low auction prices result in a decrease of gas prices? The answer is yes. So it's part of how carbon pricing works is to increase the price of fossil fuel intensive goods, including gasoline. In terms of the numbers, at the current allowance price of $26, I think at most the gas price increase would be about 20 cents. That estimate is based on Dr. Meredith Fowley's back of the envelope calculation that is available as an Energy Institute at Haas blog. Now, I think this fact is a good way to illustrate the flexibility of the cap and trade program. So the first point I would make in reaction to gas prices increasing is that Meredith Fowley's calculation does not include or it includes an assumption about output-based allocation to refineries. Those free allocations, the more that refineries receive, the lower gas prices are because they are allocated based on output, and the less they receive, the higher gas price increases are. So Meredith assumes that the output-based allocation don't impact gas prices, I believe. I will just observe that output-based allocation can be modified to keep gas prices neutral, at least from the refinery sector's perspective, or to decrease gas prices. Now, that would not eliminate the 20-cent increase that I just mentioned, but it might, to some very small extent, offset it or at least not contribute to it. So allocation is a clever way cap and trade programs can deal with price increases in sensitive sectors, I'm sorry. The second thing I'll mention, Joe spoke eloquently about electricity sector affordability. And in the electricity sector, we have the California Climate Credit, which is a way to use consigned free allowances to reduce electricity prices. And there are proposals to use auction revenue via the GGRF to further reduce electricity prices. Now, I have not heard this proposal to date, but one could imagine something similar for certain sectors in the gas, that certain households or certain socioeconomic groups that use gasoline. One could imagine either a consigned allowance feature or revenue use that could help keep certain households whole in response to higher gas prices. And the third thing I will mention on this topic is you always have to think about what your counterfactual is. So yes, the carbon price increases gas prices slightly. To some extent, that is the point. There are many clever design features to make sure that doesn't hurt economies or households too much. But remember your counterfactual. If we didn't use the carbon price, what else would we use to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And how expensive would that be, not compared to doing nothing, but to compared to doing something via the carbon price? So I hope I thoroughly answered that question. I will transition and repeat asking, what do we think might happen during the upcoming legislative recess? Is it possible to amend legislation during this time period? I'll turn to my panelists, just like raise your hand or chime in if you'd like to do so. And maybe I'll answer the softball one, which is I think it is not possible to amend legislation during the recess. So let's focus on what do we think might happen during the upcoming legislative recess. Joe or John, perhaps any speculation or any anecdotes from your previous experience in the legislature?
Yeah, I mean, during the legislative recess, there's going to be ongoing conversations between the two houses in the governor's office. Um, Hopefully, they can find some path that works on all sides, and then when we come back, we'll they can the rule waiver in place and amend a bill once they're back and move it forward. So, but there's going to be a lot of conversations.
Well said. Joe, anything to add there?
No, I think John got it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think I agree. So let's move on to the next question. What actions do you think CARB board members could take to strengthen allowance prices? I might take that. Uh, Frankly, I think the ball is in the legislature's court right now. So, as we kind of carefully outlined in the report, we think in order to restore auction revenue, two things need to happen in order. So, legislative extension needs to happen as soon as possible, and then afterwards, CARB resume its rulemaking and implement anticipated supply cuts. I think you need that legislative extension first so that extension informs the rulemaking process. That's kind of the typical order of things. So I don't see a large role for CARB board members at this time, given that the ball is firmly in the legislator's court. Any add-ons from anyone? Okay, great. Next question then. What's your expectation for how quickly CARB can go through the rulemaking process, assuming extension comes through during this legislative session? Another great question. I think I'll take another stab and then ask if speakers have to add on. I think CARB has done a good chunk of the informal work that it has to do to make the supply cuts. However, I think if things go as expected and extension occurs this year, CARB will be looking at the legislation and seeing if they have to do any additional work before formally starting their rulemaking process. I think this is a longer conversation, but usually CARB rulemakings take about a year. Really fast CARB rulemaking might be 6 months. So there are wide air bars on that question. Anything to add from the speaker's side? Nope. Okay. And then last two questions.
I think there's a follow-up question on the gas price conversation, Clayton, that you addressed up at the top of the Q&A session. And the follow-up question is, to address gas price sensitivities, is there any discussion of a rebate of some auction revenues to drivers? You talked about ways to soften, or flexible and creative ways to soften the price impacts to consumers in the economy. And this question is basically asking specifically whether there has been any discussion of a rebate of auction revenues to drivers. I will also turn this over to you and other panelists. I have not seen any discussion thus far, but maybe others have. And maybe Clayton, based on your kind of academic expertise and understanding of other markets, whether this is a feature or something that other markets have considered, I think would be an interesting question to explore as well.
No, I'll just note it. I'll note that so before starting Clean and Prosperous California, have had a long history of working in other ETSs, other cap and trade programs around the world. My sense is that in California, I think the discussion around gas prices as it comes to cap and trade is mostly around output-based allocation. and perhaps much further down the road, what can be done to kind of more formally protect California's borders if we persist in a world where other jurisdictions are not pricing carbon. So I think that's been the focus, mostly around the carbon pricing mechanism and the allowance allocation mechanism. I've not heard serious proposals around rebating. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, I can also maybe just, because the issues are touching on gas price costs, I'll just add that, I think the gas price conversation in response to the 2 refinery closures is adjacent, but not the cause of where we are right now. So it's important to reemphasize that. In general, I think there has been some very thoughtful conversation leadership about identifying a set of solutions that addresses the current issue, but does so in a way that is thoughtful and does not roll back progress. And we think that there are a lot of opportunities and that those conversations have generally been very thoughtful. So I think it is important to remember that these are slightly 2 different conversations, and it's important that the solution to the current problem is right-sized to meet what is the perceived problem of gas price, anticipated future gas price spikes.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. That's really helpful color. Let's see. Is there any chance the legislators will attempt to make at least one of the 2 refiners to reconsider their closures? I'm gonna pass on that one. I mean, I'll just generally say I'm sure legislators are attempting to do this. I'm not. I think the scope of this is what they're able to do to keep refineries in state that is above and beyond kind of competitive market dynamics seems somewhat limited. But I'll see if Joe or John have anything to add there.
Yeah, sure. I would point you to the CEC Chair Gunda's letter in response to the governor's executive order that outlines a number of different considerations.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think Joe nailed it right there. So.
Thank you, John. And John, now that you've come off mute, I have the last and spiciest question for you. Direct question. Is Cal Chamber open to small tweaks to the program to get reauthorization done this year?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've got a couple different thoughts on this. The first is in this environment where we've got a federal administration intent on tackling programs like cap and trade and specifically calling out California. The program as it currently exists has already been vetted multiple times through judicial challenge. And so introducing new features into the program that might raise concerns around the Dormant Commerce Clause or Foreign Affairs Doctrine, that could expose the program to legal challenge. The Pam Bondis of the world are sitting there waiting for something to try to hook into. Now, here's another point, though, is not, that doesn't preempt any sort of challenge in the first place coming from them. But the more we try to change the nature of the program, the less we have a program that has previously stood up to judicial challenge. I think certainly everybody has different ideas of what the program should look like. Carbon offsets are something that are fairly controversial. We think that the current 4%, 6% framework is probably too low in terms of achieving the 2045 goal of 85% emission reduction and 15% removal. We'd probably like to see that number much higher. So when it comes to what we are looking for in the program, we want strong cost containment, strong emissions leakage protection, to help keep economic activity here in California.
Excellent. Thank you for the excellent and active questions. Any last remarks from the panelists, or did we miss any questions, Alicia?
No, all good on questions. We covered them all.
Okay. Any final remarks from the panelists? Otherwise, we'll move to close. Great. Yeah, I will, maybe I'll close by dropping, Alicia, I think we have a raised hand from Jacob.
Thank you. Yes, if I don't see, I think that hand disappeared. If there are any hands, if you do have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A. Clayton, in the meantime, we can give that, I will reach out to that person regarding the Q&A, and in the meantime, you can maybe explain the link that you've just dropped in.
Yeah, sure. No, I'll just conclude with this. I think for those of you spending time in Sacramento, it's clear that there are many issues going on that are unresolved, and that the return from recess starting August 18th through the end of session is going to be very busy. And I think I wanted to reiterate a message in the report that I think Lenny put a fine point on, which is the cap and trade program has already experienced some delays, some continued uncertainty. Now is really the time for California leadership to reaffirm its commitment to the cap and trade program through legislative extension. And as I mentioned in this Politico article, now is not the time to be horse trading with climate change. So if cap and trade can largely avoid being connected to these other issues, I think that would be a better outcome for the cap and trade program, and therefore for the climate overall. We are in a climate crisis. I think this should be a top priority. So thank you all for joining today. Thanks especially to the panelists for adding color and commentary. Feel free to reach out to Clean and Prosperous California. And thanks for spending an hour of your day with us. Bye-bye.